I wanted to talk about this period of art which happened at the end of Impressionism and led all the way to the first sort of decade of the 20th century. So it's the end of the 19th century to the first decade of the 20th century. It's an extremely important period in history of technology and in art history, and they both, like I said, go hand in hand, and it's worth exploring and explaining. So by the 1880s, Impressionism was toast. I'll do another video on Impressionism per se, but just to let you know my take on Impressionism. Impressionism is the telegraph, the photograph, and the newspaper slammed together, and that's what you know, the rotary presses and photographic reproduction in newspapers. The etching had been replaced by a dot matrix, and that's essentially what Impressionism is. So we get up to the 1880s, Impressionism is toast as well, and now painters are faced with a new dilemma, and a lot of things are happening technologically as well at that time. But in painting per se, there was a real sort of yearning for something else, and so there was a whole group of painters who are called the Symbolists, who I simply call the Post-Impressionists, really, who broke Impressionism into pieces and took it a step further. And then you get guys like Van Gogh and Gauguin. And Gauguin was really trying to find something new. And Gauguin, through his research, and remember, Gauguin was a stockbroker first, but then there was a market collapse, and he decided to go all in with painting. So, you know, he was kind of a risk taker, and he took a lot of risks, and obviously some very big risks. And so he decided to basically break painting, and that's what he ended up doing. And Gauguin had to find a way to reach deep into this romantic notion of, we're no longer going to represent things, we're going to represent what Carl Jung might call archetypes, or deep-seated subconscious, and this is also the time of Freud coming to the fore, deep-seated subconscious feelings and things that we can't control, you know, things that are, they're like at the level of instincts, or they're at the level of fundamental drives, you know, sort of a deep dive into the subconscious. He would often paint paintings and say, I don't know where this comes from. I don't know what it means. Actually, one of his most famous paintings is Who Are We? Where Are We Going? You know, and that's what captured these guys' imagination. And Gauguin, you know, that's why he fled to Tahiti, and was like, I need to be among the, you know, the uncivilized and the primitives, and he created a form of art that can be called primitive. It's primitive symbolism. So it was almost automatic art, not quite yet, but it was getting there early. And it's interesting to note what the critics said about his art. They weren't so upset with his style. What they were upset with was essentially that they called him too ethnographic. In other words, they were aware of what he was doing, but they just thought it was too ethnographically oriented. It was too much, it was lifted. In other words, it was lifted from Tahiti, you know, in a way. But Tahiti didn't really have art. Tahiti only has design. You know, tribal art is only design. So the only art that Tahiti had was design. I mean, they had floral designs, and you can see some of the floral designs and plant designs and some of Gauguin's paintings. But he was still painting people and places and stuff. But so they were wrong in the sense that he had just lifted their art. He hadn't. He was creating something that was basically a merger of the sensibilities of the primitive sort of sensibility and, you know, all his background as a, you know, technological European. so one of the biggest criticism he had was by one of his fellow painters, which was Camille Pissaro, who is a impressionist painter, who I really like Camille Pissaro. I always thought he was really good. But Camille Pissaro said this: Gauguin is currently doing a show that has won the admiration of the literati. They are enraptured, or so it appears. And he's talking about the Symbolists. The Symbolist poets loved Gauguin. But of course, they were all broke too, so, you know, didn't really make any difference. The collectors, on the other hand, they tell me, unanimously consider this art too caught up in the South Sea Islanders. Only Degas thinks highly of it. Monet and Renoir find it simply bad. Well, Monet and Renoir are second-rate artists, so, you know, too bad for them. Renoir is the most hyped-up, awful artist of the Impressionists and Post-Impressionists period. Monet is hardly better. Manet is much better than Monet. I saw Gauguin. He expounded on his theories about art and assured me that the young would find salvation by replenishing themselves at faraway, savage sources. I told him that his art did not belong to him. This is very interesting, that he was a civilized man. And he ends by saying, we parted both unconvinced. That's a fair criticism from Pissaro. That actually, he says that the art didn't belong to him, that he was a civilized man. Maybe what he was failing to see, that he was actually breaching the gap between that period of Impressionism, which Pissaro was a pillar of, and what was to come later. Right in that transitional period, there's the Symbolists, obviously, and you know, there's all a bunch of subdivisions like Pre-Raphealites and all that kind of stuff. That's really, those are very secondary kind of movements. But there's also Expressionism that starts. And there's, most importantly, to my mind, the Fauves. And what the Fauves did is they took the color palette that Gauguin had basically initiated, and he was only able to do that by divorcing himself completely from, you know, the modern civilized world and going out into the South Pacific and seeing these bright colors and just saying, I'm just painting what I feel and these bright colors, etc. And the Fauves, they were now taking colors that didn't make any sense and painting people with green faces. And keep this in mind, because this is going to be very important for later. Green faces and purple hair, and these are all things that, you know, now color is detached from reality as well. So not only is representation detached from reality through painting the effect or painting moods through the romanticism and the symbolism, but now you also have color, which is being detached from reality, whereby, you know, you can paint a person's face using any color, you know, pink or purple or blue or green. And so that's what the Fauves did, but Gauguin started that, and the Fauves did take that on, and he was right. The young will be inspired by my work, and he was right about that, because what Gauguin was doing is he was using color and so was Van Gogh also, right out of the tube, just not mixing the colors and just going straight for the gusto. And the primary colors, I mean, and this was pretty revolutionary back then. Of course, today it's not, and I'll explain how that evolved. But back then that was very, very iconoclastic, and even for the Impressionists. And he was just using color fields, and you know, Van Gogh was still kind of an Impressionist with his brushstrokes. Van Gogh is a particular case. I'm not very fond of Van Gogh, to be honest. I think he's hyper inflated in terms of what he contributed and what his art is worth, and I think it's more of an investment vehicle now. But But Gauguin really paved the way for the Fauves. But of course, he completely descended into this untenable position where he, I think, maybe put too much emphasis on sort of the savage, the primitive, the noble savage kind of idea from the Enlightenment. And of course, that's a dead end, obviously, you know, because there's nothing noble by living as a savage, especially not for a civilized man. I mean, these two worlds will collide and produce, you know, terrible, terrible outcomes. I mean, he died of syphilis. He was a pedophile. He was, you know, a failed man. He failed his family, and he was a commercial dud. Obviously, that's a little bit more unfortunate, I think. But you know, he had a lot of really bad sort of things going for him. He's an alcoholic. Fauvism is sort of the last bastion of representational art. Even though there was a lot of Fauvism that did not include representational stuff, it still tended to stick pretty closely to representing things, even though the colors were completely interpolated. And that's the sort of the last gasp of that period between the 1880s and the 1910s that I will call the Symbolist or the Post-Impressionist period. And so it gives rise to the Primitivism, and then it gives rise to Fauvism, and then with the speed up of photography and cinematography, it gives rise to all of a sudden all these other isms that happen in really, really quick succession. Futurism, and all these other kind of isms. But the biggest one obviously is Cubism. And remember I was talking about the green faces. Picasso grabbed that, and he, you know, they have, you know, call it his blue period or whatever the case may be. So he grabbed that detaching of the colors from reality. But what he was able to do with George Braque is to realize that the technological change that had happened with cinematography and the rotary presses of newspapers flying off the presses was, he came up with he had a challenge now, and the challenge was how to represent this speed up and this motion. And that's what Cubism is. A lot of critics will say that Cubism is representation from multiple different angles at once. And I disagree. Cubism is sped up photography. Cubism is cinematography where you have pictures that are flying by at such a quick rate that you have the semblance of motion. And that's what they were trying to do on the canvas. And if you want to see a perfect example of that, look at Marcel Duchamp's Nude Descending a Staircase. That is motion. It's not views from different angles. It's just motion. It's actually a person walking down the stairs, and all the lines and all the breaking up is to give it motion. And that's what Cubism is. Cubism is injecting motion into the canvas. And so now you have detachment from representational, linear, realistic reality, detachment from color truism. In other words, you can swap colors any way you want. And now you also have detachment virtually from the canvas itself. And this is a huge impact, and this will inform the whole 20th century in terms of what happens with Cubism now, in terms of detaching the painting from the canvas. Now, I'll leave it at that, except for to say that while this was happening in Europe, what was happening in America, of course, was, like I said, the inventions of the light bulb, the inventions of the telephone, inventions of all sorts of things, the phonograph, and then eventually with Tesla, the invention of alternative current, ways to distribute electricity even more practically. And of course, a very, very, very important American art form that came out at that time. There's two. One is comics in the newspapers, because Americans were still very focused on the newspapers, and jazz, which was sort of the musical representation of what was happening technologically. So I'll get into those in another video. I thought it was interesting to highlight that period from the 1880s to the 1910s, transitional period. I think it has its reverberation in Dada, which happened right after the First World War, where you have these hinge periods, these transition periods, which a lot of things happen, and they inform what comes next. And so I would just say that that was a very interesting era.